Hello, and welcome to the second seminar in Southampton's Faculty of Arts and Humanities Advanced Seminar Series 2020. This seminar series is on pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. And the event is part of the wider programme of the Human Worlds Festival, organised by the Public Engagement with Research Unit at the University of Southampton, and running from the 12th to the 22nd of November. If you want to comment on social media about today's event, please use the festival hashtag #HumanWorlds. So this seminar series is on pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. As I said, we aim to bring researchers working on relevant topics across and beyond the arts and humanities into conversation with each other and with you, the audience. If you missed the first seminar on pregnancy, do note that a recording is available on YouTube and Facebook. But this second seminar focuses on motherhood. We will be exploring expectations and representations of mothers from the past to the modern day, maternal and infant health and well-being, and the pressure and judgment that many mothers feel. My name's Alexander Geddes. I'm from philosophy at the University of Southampton, and I'll be chairing today. But in our panel, we're very pleased to have first Mark Hanson from Medicine and DOHAD, which stands for Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. Hi, Mark, who will be talking about maternal responsibility and blame, preparing for pregnancy, and the impact of COVID-19 on maternal and child health. And second, I want to welcome Mariana Thomas from English. Hi, Mariana. She's going to be talking about maternal life writing. And third and finally, Fiona Woolard from philosophy. Hi, Fiona. Talking about why we need philosophy of pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood. So we're going to begin with a panel discussion. This will last until 2:35. We'll then have a break of slightly under 5 minutes, and we'll return at 2:40 for a question and answer session. And during the Q&A session, we're going to invite you to send questions or comments for the speakers to respond to. Okay, and I'm going to begin by asking our speakers to tell us a little bit about themselves and their research on motherhood, in turn, beginning with Mark Hanson. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I work in the Faculty of Medicine, and my research for many years has been on the prevention of the diseases which sadly account for more than 70% of deaths around the world. Now, you might think in the current crisis that we're in that would refer to infectious diseases, things like COVID. But actually, it doesn't. It refers to the so-called non-communicable diseases. These are cardiovascular diseases such as coronary heart disease, stroke and hypertension, diabetes, chronic lung disease, some forms of cancer, and the risk factors associated with them, such as obesity. Now, most of us, including myself, are brought up to believe that these diseases are the result of poor, unhealthy adult lifestyle. But our research, going back really since about the mid-1980s, has shown that that's actually not true. It's partially true, but there is an enormous component, which is previously unrecognised, which comes from inherited risk of these diseases passed across generations. The research has shown that that's not just the fixed inherited genes that we get from our mothers and fathers. It's something more complicated than that, a range of factors, many of them operating in pregnancy: poor diet, obesity, unhealthy lifestyles such as smoking, taking recreational drugs, stress and violence and so on, in pregnancy, and to a degree related to fathers as well. That takes us to the question, well, excuse me, exactly when in pregnancy are these things operating? And the answer to that seems to be in very early pregnancy as well as later pregnancy. And that's taken the research into the whole realm of preconception lifestyle and preconception health. The field, as Alex said, has been to a degree framed, I think rather wrongly, as attributing blame to mothers. I think one of the reasons for that is that scientists and researchers, and I include myself in this, are sometimes very good at discovering mechanisms, but often not quite so good about communicating their knowledge, or indeed their uncertainty about wider unknowns, underlying processes. And I hope we'll come back to that a little in the discussion. But it does raise the whole question of responsibility and blame. And that's one of the things that's interested me and exercised me over the last few years. And it's made me very glad to work with colleagues in the humanities, in a wide range of humanities subjects, and in the social sciences, to explore underlying mechanisms for the origins of these non-communicable diseases in a wider societal sense. And of course, that's taken us very much into issues of gender, reproductive and social rights, and justice. And of course, over the last year, it's made us focus very much actually on the communicable disease that's troubling us all, COVID, because research around the world, and I hope we'll have a chance to touch on this, has affected women and mothers and children in particular far more than men. So, as I say, I hope we'll come back to that. I think I've probably said enough by way of introduction. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Alex.
All right, thanks, Mark. Mariana, could you introduce yourself and your work?
Yes, of course. Thank you. So, as Alex said, I'm from English, though my work does cross over into other areas. Primarily, my work explores the facets of maternal subjectivity within an emerging form of women's writing on motherhood. These are texts which are less concerned with cultural or sociological investigation and more with what one of my authors, Sarah Manguso, terms the pure states of being associated with the maternal experience. So there are three elements of these texts that my work focuses on. Firstly, the mother as existing as in an altered temporality, the ambivalent mother-daughter relationship, and finally, the mother as a subject as being constantly in process. This form is new. This is a form of new literature itself, is a reflection of these altered states of being, and this is what makes it a subgenre which refuses to conform to existing parameters of form. So, thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mariana. And finally, Fiona, could you just introduce yourself and your work?
Thank you very much, Alex. So I work in philosophy of pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood, which is quite a new field. And basically, my aims in this field are to both use it to make philosophy better and use it to make things better for mothers and their babies. So I think philosophy, pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood are philosophically extremely interesting. They challenge our thinking in a range of areas. For example, one of my papers, which is co-authored with Elston Kingma, looks at whether ethical concepts such as the distinction between doing and allowing harm apply to in pregnancy. And I also think that thinking about motherhood can shed light on issues such as how we understand duties, just a whole range of things. I'm working on philosophical understandings of achievement at the moment. But another thing that I think is really important is to try and use philosophy to improve our thinking about motherhood and to clear up some of what I see as kind of philosophical confusions, which I think make conversations about parenting and about the choices that we make and what happens to us as mothers very difficult, and make cause a lot of pain, shame, and guilt for mothers. So trying to have a practical difference there as well.
Great, thank you very much, all of you. Okay, I'd like to set things off in the panel discussion by asking Mark a question. So Mark, the scientific research in which you've been involved for many years is really in the field of medicine, as you said. Yet from what you're saying, it's clear that now its implications extend well beyond that into society, ethics, and policy. So how are you and your colleagues making that transition?
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, that's a very good question. Society, ethics, and policy. I'm going to say something a little bit about each of those. And of course, it's taking very much the cue from what Fiona has just said. We absolutely need to move away from this blame of mothers and just passing the responsibility to them, it's completely unethical, and of course it's completely ineffective too, because we know there are much bigger issues. In the university, on the societal side, we've been trying to engage very much with young people to get their views about what it is that influences their lifestyle. I referred to the preconception environment a moment ago. So we set up something in a hospital actually called Life Lab, and we've now brought more than 10,000 young people, 15, 16-year-olds from Southampton into the hospital under the banner of me, my health and my children's health. And we started to explore with them the issues around what makes them healthy or unhealthy and what they feel about the future and the future for their children. Coupled with that has been much more data-based research looking at the preconception period, where we've been able to show, sadly, that if you look at particularly teenage pregnancies in women under the age of, girls under the age of 18, that in this country they're very much associated with poor educational status, with low socioeconomic grouping, often or sometimes rather English as a second language, with domestic violence, with smoking and taking drugs. So we begin to see the bigger social picture of what underlies these risk factors. And one of the experts in the field, Sir Michael Marmot, who just over a decade ago authored a famous report, the Marmot Report, which was on the social inequalities of disease. And he talks about the causes of disease, which we can almost imagine. You can meet someone who has COVID, you catch COVID. But then says, but what are the underlying causes? What are the causes of the causes, if you like? Really the bigger societal factors. So through our research, we've been trying to get some information about those. On the ethical side, I think this has really taken us into the territory of what health means and the right to health and the justice issues associated with having poor health. This is something that's ever since the founding of the World Health Organization, the United Nations just after the Second World War, and the beginnings of ethical movements, has never really been carefully worked out, especially when it relates to reproductive and sexual health. And lastly, policy, I think you said, Alex. So we've worked with a range of organizations internationally, World Health Organization, for example, trying to come up with the kind of policy guidance documents. We worked a lot around childhood obesity, for example, trying to influence governments to make better decisions and better policies to try and prevent disease, rather than just waiting for these diseases to happen and then trying to treat them. Of course, that's very ineffective. It's been partially effective and in some ways not so. I'm hoping very much that what's happening with the COVID disaster, because that's what it is really, is going to shake everybody up and think we're not going to go back to the new normal. We're going to have a very different look at the causes of the causes. And many colleagues around the world are now beginning to move from their labs into this bigger space, which I think we should have occupied a long time ago, and talk to colleagues like the others on this webinar who can give us so much help.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there'll be a lot to follow up on that later. But for now, to moving just, Marianne, asked you a follow-up question to direct the next question to you. So your work suggests that there's a new subgenre of maternal life writing emerging. What do you see as the defining qualities of this developing form of literature?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so that's primarily the main thesis of my work, is that there is this developing, emerging form of women's life writing about motherhood. And it's something that's developed over perhaps the last 2 decades, starting in 2000 with probably Rachel Cusk's well-known memoir, A Life's Work, which really sort of set off a lot more happening in that genre. And for probably the first decade, it was primarily more popular books. The slang term memoir was used to refer to them, and they weren't really taken seriously as serious literature. But in the last decade, in line with Rachel Cusk's the style of her memoir, there's been these more serious memoirs and sort of these sort of experimental forms of life writing about motherhood that really look at the big philosophical questions that come about when we think about maternal experience and pregnancy and everything and things associated with it. And actually what's really defining about them is that they take these sort of mundane experiences, you know, everyday lived experience of motherhood, and they put it alongside these big ontological questions that before now have not really been put together in literature. And also another feature is that they take the experiences of motherhood, so the sort of frequent interruptions, the what I've looked at as the constant sort of present tense that you're living in, and they echo these in the form themselves with sort of fragmented text, this experimental form of sort of jumping around, not having a linear narrative. So that really is the defining features of what I'm arguing is a new subgenre of life writing.
Yeah, really interesting. Fiona, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, I was so interested with what you said, Mariana, about the way in which you're saying this is really serious literature that we're seeing now. Do you think that there's a sort of struggle to get literature which deals with things like maternal experiences recognized as serious literature?
Definitely, and I think actually, if we go back to Rachel Cusk, you know, she's done so much for the genre, and I think when you think about the responses and that she got when she published her book, it was denigrated in the press, and you know, people were saying, you know, how dare she put this in a serious literature, category, you know, these mundane everyday experiences that don't need to be written about because they just are, you know. And I think it was a real watershed moment, and there's been a push ever since to get these more into a serious form of, you know, memoir and life writing. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. But Fiona, I want to invite you now to say a bit more about your work, because you say that you want to use philosophy to make things better for mothers. So why do you think we need to make things better for mothers, and how do you think philosophy can help do that?
Thank you so much, Alex. Well, I think you only have to talk to a new mother, or even a mother who's, you know, a mother of a child who's 5, 6, 10, 20, 30 to see why we need to make things better for mothers, because mothers experience a huge amount of pressure. They feel like they're being judged. They feel guilt and shame, and many negative emotions, which can have really, really devastating effects on their well-being. And so I think that we can use philosophy to help with some of that, or I hope that it can, by looking at the way in which our thinking about motherhood is really messed up and leads to increased pressure on mothers. So to take an example, I think one of the things that I've worked on is unpicking how mistakes in our thinking about maternal duties can lead to problems in our discussion of infant feeding decisions about how we feed our babies. And here I use the concept of a defeasible duty. So a defeasible duty is a duty that can be outweighed. So your duty is what you have to do, and a duty is defeasible if it can be outweighed, if you have a good enough reason. And defeasible duties have many features, but the most important one is that they make you liable to justify your behavior. And if you can't give a good enough justification, you're supposed to feel guilty and other people can blame you. So I have a defeasible duty to turn up to this seminar, but if, for example, I got trapped under a tree this morning and would have had to, gnaw off my own leg to get here, it's okay. I don't have to. But if I didn't turn up, everybody would get, I could get this series of emails. Where are you? What's happened? And I would have to have some good enough excuse. So I think that we misapply these defeasible duties in our thinking about motherhood and about infant feeding decisions. And we treat both breastfeeding and not breastfeeding as if they are subject to defeasible duties and need justification. So we act as if not breastfeeding needs justification. You'll see lots of people talking about why they didn't breastfeed, and they always feel they have to give all this list of reasons. But also, breastfeeding is treated like it needs justification. You have to say, "Oh no, it's still got nutritional benefits," or I'm going to be really discreet doing it. And I think that kind of leads to a kind of problem because it pits women against each other, because women who want to breastfeed feel as if they need to say that it's required in order to make it permissible to do. And so I think we need to recognise both a right to breastfeed and a right not to breastfeed, and that will ease much of the discussion around infant feeding. So that's an example of how I think the philosophy might happen.
Yeah, very interesting. And Mark, did you want to come in on this?
Oh, yeah. So, Fiona, if I understand what you're saying, and I very much sympathise with it, I think, is that breastfeeding, which has been a very contentious issue, has to be seen as context specific. We do quite a lot of work, for example, in Singapore, where breastfeeding is relatively unusual because most women feel after maybe a month or so of looking after it, they need to go back to work for financial reasons. And also they need to employ other individuals, very often women, who will then take on the childcare. So actually the whole economy is structured around the context that actually breastfeeding might be nice to have, but it's not something that really is central to what's required. Is that what you're saying, that we need, particularly in this country and perhaps in the States and parts of Europe, where these things have almost got to really be a real personal battleground, we need to have a much more nuanced view on the cultural factors that underlie the decision to breastfeed or not, rather than just to say breast is best, and if you can't do it, well, you better feel guilty as a mum because somehow you've let the baby down.
So I'm definitely against saying breast is best, and if you can't do it, you've let your baby down. But I think the philosophically tricky bit is trying to say breastfeeding is important, and if a mother wants to breastfeed, she should be supported to do so. It's not a kind of optional extra. She has a right to breastfeed. Well, technically her and the baby have a right to breastfeed, a dyadic right, without saying that if you don't breastfeed, you should feel guilty, because equally I think women have a right not to breastfeed, because I don't think they have a duty to breastfeed. So I think it's locating that right with the mother and the baby. They have a right as a dyad to breastfeed, rather than a right from the baby against the mother to breastfeed. And the right is really against society to support parents to feed their babies in the way that works for them. So, for example, the mother that you talked about who wants to go back to work should be enabled, if she wishes to have breaks to pump or to connect with her child for opportunities to breastfeed her child. So we need to work around the mothers.
Yeah, that's where society falls down terribly, isn't it? The support for women to breastfeed in the workplace, for example, or even just out of the house is minimal compared to the amount of support and money that's injected into the infant formula provision by, of course, the companies that make those things. So it's terribly unbalanced.
It really is. I mean, what I feel at the moment is that we get mothers told that they have to breastfeed and being made to feel they have a duty, while at the same time not being supported. And I want exactly the opposite. I want mothers to have a right to breastfeed, and a right not to breastfeed, and to be supported whichever choice they make.
Yeah, that's great. And actually on some of these issues. Mariana, I think that you had a question for Fiona that's connected to what we've been talking about, the pressures and judgments on mothers.
Yeah, definitely it is. So I wondered, I was thinking as you were speaking then, I was wondering when breastfeeding got entered into the public debate rather than, because motherhood is in this strange paradox of being very privatized and very much, within just the domestic setting, but then also judged in a very public setting as well. And I wondered how you think the advent of social media has changed the dialogue, the narrative around breastfeeding.
I think it's had a really significant effect. I think it's both been really helpful in some ways. I mean, I know when I was up at 2 a.m. feeding my baby, things were going wrong and I needed advice, I could just write something on my phone and I could get advice right then. So it made me feel much less alone. But I guess it also made me feel much less alone in the sense of always, I could always be judged and what I was doing was always visible. I think one problem with social media is that it's very difficult to catch tone, to understand the background assumptions that people are coming with. So discussions on social media quite often can degenerate really quickly. And you see the sort of the pressures just really blooming as people say things that they would never say if somebody was in front of them in person. So I think that the issues that we've always had with motherhood, plus the effects of social media, really come together to make very difficult situations possible, and people, really coming to feel very, very judged and very, very miserable.
On the topic of the pressures as well, Fiona, I think you have some concerns that relate to the sort of work that Mark does. So, and I think you had a question for him about the wider social context that the work he does takes place in and potentially feeds into.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. So, I've often been quite critical of the way that medical and scientific research is presented and can feed into the immense pressure and judgment that surrounds mothers. But of course, at the same time, you have to recognize the importance of the goals that most researchers have, which is to provide parents with information and to improve public health. So I'm just interested, Mark, in how you balance that, how you try to inform people and improve health outcomes without adding to this judgment.
We have to find, thank you, it's a very important question. And medical research has a bad history of gender balance. There have been far too many trials that have just used men or predominantly male subjects, and they're thinking, oh, well, of course we can apply it to everybody then. More and more that's being corrected, I think, and now most research bodies and ethics committees would insist that there was an equal gender balance if the question is relevant to humanity in general. We try, as I said, in relation to Life Lab and our other focus group work, to try and get much better, much clearer insights into the way in which members of society, particularly young people and mothers and fathers to be, engage with these areas and the kind of questions that interest them, if nothing else, because we realise that we won't be able to change things unless we bring the public with us. I mean, policy in relation to health in this country and most others is really related to three things. It's whether or not there is an answer, which scientists can come up with, whether it's affordable, which is the economic question, and then thirdly, is it actually going to be a vote winner or not? Is it going to be something that people support and want to see? Because however good for them you think it is, and however affordable and based on the science, if the public won't adopt it, I mean, we've seen all the confusion about the guidelines around COVID, and so where it's not adopted, it's not going to work, and that's of course what we've seen. So I think on the research side of things, that's true. On the treatment and the work that we do in the hospital, it's now very, very much more focused around public and patient involvement. So on most of our committees and research programs, and actually many of our conferences like this, we have patient reps coming in. They're a rather special group of patients, of course, because they're the ones who are interested in talking about it. But at least they can help to give us feedback on what it is we're doing and whether it really is relevant and whether it's appropriate. But I think there's a bigger issue, which we've actually got to somehow really get to the social justice side of things in relation to reproductive rights and women's rights and gender issues in this whole area of human development, not only in the sense of how we grow, but also human development in economic terms. We've got a long way to go, I think.
Right, and agreed. But just before we break, because the break's coming up soon, it'd be good to hear a bit more about Mariana's work. And earlier, Mariana, you spoke about Rachel Cusk's Motherhood memoir. And Mark, I think you had a question for Mariana, partly about something to do with that.
Sure, yeah. No, I was delighted that you brought Rachel Cusk up because, and you said she was a watershed. She was certainly a watershed for me. I mean, obviously, I'm an elderly white male, so you can imagine it might take me a lifetime for the penny to actually drop. But it certainly did in reading her life's work. And it related very strongly to one of my interests, which is in relation to inequalities. And there's a quote from her, which I use for all my medical students, saying that childbirth and motherhood are the anvil on which sexual inequality was forged. And I love that anvil term of this thing being hammered out and very difficult to change later. But I suppose the question I had for you, Mariana, was that given that reproduction and childbirth has been going on for a while, why has it taken writers, whether they're women or men, so long to actually engage with motherhood in the way that Cusk has done? You talked about the things following on from her work, but good heavens, why has it taken us so long?
Thanks, Mark. I think that's a really interesting question, and it has so many possible answers, so many factors to it. And I mean, first of all, I'll pick up on what you said about, it's been happening so long. And I think that's one of the reasons that it hasn't been brought up, it hasn't been a main subject in literature before now, is that it's just an assumed experience. People it's not something that is, thought of as something that should be questioned or should be studied in a significant way. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason, in a practical way, the mothers I know who are also writers, in a practical sense, it's just that they have so little time, which is good time for writing, because they're rarely alone. So they suffer on a practical sense of getting their stories down. And then also I think the reason why it's happening now is I think that it's to do with shifts in feminism. That used to be that we thought that the mother, feminists largely thought that motherhood was a site of oppression. That they were trying to sort of get away from the maternal experience, and now feminists of this generation are perhaps ready to return to it. And I think lastly, the just narratives as they are in their very linear sense, most of the time literary narratives are very linear, to really go against what the maternal experience is like, in that it's not a linear thing. It might seem to be because it comes in this pregnancy, and then motherhood comes in these stages, but actually the experience of it is quite different, and can feel like this, because it hasn't been written before and it hasn't been represented in existing narratives. There isn't a roadmap, there isn't a rubric for how to write it in narratives now. So I think, as I said, there's lots of reasons why.
It worries me a lot, because if you look at the childbirth, pregnancy and childbirth are very dangerous activities. Maternal mortality is still amazingly high in many parts of the lower middle income countries, and of course it was in, say, Victorian England. It's almost as if I suppose it was just assumed that, well, this is what women do. They have children, and so yes, some of them die. But there we are. So as you say, maybe it took second-wave feminism anyway, the beginnings of reproductive and rights and sexual rights, to actually begin to think, no, hang on, we have a choice here. We're maybe linked to a greater awareness of risk and the choices that are associated with that, rather than just making the assumption that this is what women did, and sadly sometimes it doesn't turn out very well.
Absolutely. I think there's that, like you said about that assumption that, it's finally being questioned. And also the women of the generation that are writing these now are women that have had been focused on the career, they've been brought up in this, this feeling of individualism, self-reliance, autonomy and things like that. So when they come to motherhood, there's this outrage of, hang on, why did no one tell me it was like this? And so they turn on to, whether it's the internet or whether it's anything, there's a whole, there's a lot more growth in talking and writing about motherhood in lots of different settings.
Okay, so I think we're coming back to many of these issues after the break, but thank you to all three of you for the very stimulating panel discussion. But it's time to stop now for our break, which will be just under 5 minutes, and after which we're going to return to discuss questions and comments from viewers. During the break, we're going to be sharing an animated video from Fiona's project on feeling good about feeding babies. So I encourage everyone to stay and watch that, and we'll see you on the other side. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, hello, and welcome back to the University of Southampton's Faculty of Arts and Humanities Advanced Seminar Series 2020. This seminar is on motherhood, and during the break, some of you will hopefully have watched the video on feeling good about feeding babies. So I'll take the opportunity to note that you might also enjoy Fiona's feeling good about feeding babies activity, craft, and a chat for parents and children. This is a fun activity for parents and young children to do together, with a little extra exploration of Fiona's philosophical research for parents. You can access the activity by going to the Human Worlds website, which is humanworldsfestival.com, clicking on Human Worlds Digital and scrolling down. The activity launched on the 12th of November, but can be enjoyed anytime that's convenient for you. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the question and answer session with all of our panelists. As I noted earlier, you can submit questions or comments through the chat functions on YouTube or Facebook, or if you're unable to comment in this way, you can send questions using the Contact Us form on the Southampton Human Worlds website. So humanworldsfestival.com/contact_us/. Okay, so the first questions we've got here are from Ronya, and I think I have been pronouncing that correctly, and I think I directed the whole panel. So these questions are, how culturally specific is pregnancy research? So are temporality or duties, etc., perceived differently across different communities, both between cultures and within cultures? What role does class play? And more generally, how do we incorporate the widening scope of motherhood, which includes adoption by homosexual couples, surrogacy, transgender pregnancy, and similar? So I open that up to the panel.
Well, sorry, Fiona.
No, you go first.
I was just going to say that this is something that actually I hadn't mentioned about the texts that I look at, is that they're very, they're all of women of a certain education class. They're all white women. They're mostly from the UK and America. So it's, even if I talk about it in a general sense, it's still a very small number of group of mothers who are writing about their experiences. And I definitely find this troubling. And I've searched really, really hard for a wider scope of women who are writing about different experiences of motherhood. I have one text by Maggie Nelson, who, you may have heard of, and she's, she talks about having a baby with her transgender partner, Harry. And that's really as close as it comes to any different kind of experiences. In fact, all the texts that I look at are women who are actually, they're obviously writers, and they're women who teach in universities as well. So it's a very small group of women. And I'm really looking forward to a wider range of women and other people writing about their maternal experiences.
So Fiona, you wanted to come on this as well?
Oh, well, one thing that I might say in response to Mariana is that I have a list of widespread writings on pregnancy and motherhood from a wide range of backgrounds, which I sourced from a Facebook group that I'm part of. So I can pass that over to you. One of my favorites is by Chita Ramaswamy, who is a Scottish Indian, I think, half Scottish, half Indian, lesbian, and her experience of pregnancy. It's a beautiful book. But there are other writers out there. But I wanted to talk about the specific question about how culturally specific is this research, and how do duties they perceive differently across different communities. I think that what we have here is often an interplay between kind of things that seem to be almost universal and things that seem to be very specific. So I think you get kind of you get in basically, in general, mothers seem to be required to justify departing from what's seen as the default. But what is the default will differ from community to community. So what counts as breastfeeding for too long? Most Subcultures will have a sense of what counts as breastfeeding for too long. Some of the times it'll be 2 months, sometimes it'll be 6 years, but there's some sorts of sense, so it varies. And is formula feeding the default, or is breastfeeding the default? There are many variations, but there's this an overarching pattern of requiring justification for things that are perceived as departing from a default. Another way in which we have an interesting interplay is that quite often, so this is something that Quill R. Kulkler, writing as Rebecca Kulkler, points out, and they say that we have these images of motherhood which are white and middle class and thin and healthy, and that people who don't fit in with these are kind of automatically judged as falling short just by the nature of not falling into those categories. So that's a way in which they see these kind of universal ideas being kind of applied and kind of ruling out some people as being good mothers from the get-go. But you also see different expectations and different standards varying from community to community.
And certainly on the medical research side, we're very aware of the enormous cultural differences globally, whether it's something that you think would be fairly universal, like what are the best foods to eat in pregnancy. In some cultures, fruit is the thing, you must do this, don't go anywhere near eggs. In other cultures, you must have 3 eggs a day. And so following up actually the consequences of that for the pregnancy outcomes and the health of the children is one stream of research, but I think we've hardly scratched the surface of how these cultural differences arise, how they're enforced, and how men and women and families share in them, because I think if we can learn a lot about the process of motherhood and why it's so, the concept is so important to humans from comparing different cultures. Most of the research, of course, has come from the US or Europe, English-speaking countries, and as Mariana said in relation to writing, it's very, 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 very narrow so far.
So the next question we've got is from Nicola, and this is for you, Mark. She asks, do you find that there is interest in funding research relating to causes of ill health as opposed to treatments?
It's been very difficult, I think, to get adequate funding for the kind of work that we do, partly because it's much easier to think of treatment than it is to think of prevention. In fact, books have been written on the dichotomy between, well, we see it, let's take the COVID example. We know that the actions that we all need to take and the support for them largely has to come at local government level, and yet the policy is made at central government level. So there's a huge mismatch immediately. And unless there's appropriate funding put into the local government level, it's actually very hard to change anything. The other issue I think that we faced was, so that's the prevention issue, is that when you think of the early origins of disease, these are possibly decades, many, many years before the manifestations of disease may take place. So when we started a pioneering study in Southampton in the mid-1980s called the mid-1990s called the Southampton Women's Survey, where we planned to study a range of women and their families in Southampton. These are healthy, fit families, no medical issues, from before conception all the way through to childhood and into adolescence. Obviously, you're talking about 10, 15, 20 years of funding. No funding body will ever provide that. It's taken a long time. Actually, now World Health Organization with Gates and some other organizations are funding some long-term studies over a 10-year time frame in India, Canada, South Africa, and China. But it's taken a long time to get that perception that we need, if we're talking about the life course, to have funding avenues which will actually support a life course frame rather than just looking for quick solutions to immediate problems.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. So in order to move around speakers a little bit, I'll take some questions out of order. The next question is from Fiona, and this is to Mariana. And she asks, are there books by author mothers to adults reflecting on their experiences?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I look at. You know, I exclusively look at female writers who are mothers, who are writing from a, you know, subjective position as mothers. So that's what I look at in particular, and that's what has exponentially grown in the last couple of decades. So yes, that's exactly what I look at, and there's definitely a really growing number, and it's, you know, creating its own subgenre here of mothers writing about their experiences. But actually, that's growing, and actually in fiction and things like that, you know, it's still quite stagnant. There isn't as much, you know, there's not as many protagonists who are mothers and things like that. So it really is in the memoir form of women writers who have had the, you know, maternal experience, writing about that experience themselves.
Sorry about that. A moment. I'm back now. So the next question, this was directed to you, Mark. So this is from Rebecca. So what do you think the role is for researchers in shaping research questions and communicating findings such that individual mothers do not perceive blame for situations outside their control?
I think it's a great question. Thank you, Rebecca. I think we have to start by actually talking to mothers, to families, to young girls, women of reproductive age generally, to find out the kind of questions that actually they would like answered, and then develop research programs in conjunction with them, which really answer that need. I was very struck, just a brief anecdote, by a colleague of mine working in Burkina Faso, who wanted to set up a program with WHO support to try and promote contraception in a rural community. He was aware of the fact that arguably too many children were being born. He went into the community and started to talk to families. And after a while, several of the women came up to him afterwards and said, "We're very keen to support what you will do. But first of all, can you help us to make sure our children survive?" So it's all very well in that case to talk about contraception, but in an area where you have high neonatal and post and infant mortality, that's actually not the driving question. So he changed the nature of his research to look at the question which was actually relevant to the population. So I think we have to start by talking to populations as well as just our scientific and medical colleagues. And then when we have that information and our research results, we've got to be much better at talking to government about what they really mean, and not fighting shy of playing some of the ethical social justice cards that I referred to earlier on, saying, look, it worked very well with, say, maternal mortality, to be able to say, look, how can it be that every few minutes a woman dies in childbirth or in late pregnancy? This is just immoral. We have to do something about it. We haven't gone a bit further now and said, but the whole issue of motherhood and all the problems that are associated with it have not been sufficiently recognised. How can you as a government not relate to this? Sorry to get on a soapbox.
No, that's part of the purpose of this. Get on those soapboxes. So the next question is for both Mark and Mariana, although you might want to come in on it too, Fiona. Again from Fiona, asking how, I mean, it relates to this in a way, how can research findings be communicated in a meaningful way? What is the role of the arts in that?
Well, I think from my point of view, from English, coming from English, I think there's definitely been a lot of success now in putting them in life writing and memoirs. And I think it can play. I don't know if Mark would. I mean, he's brought up Rachel Cusk, so it's obviously had a profound influence on, perhaps his work as well. These writings about motherhood is coming into the more general conversation about the experience of motherhood. I don't know if Mark wants to say about how it influences his research, perhaps.
I think not sufficiently, I would say. I would like, just occurred to me as you were talking there, Marianne, I must just do a quick poll to see how many of my colleagues have read a life's work, and I think it may well be very, very few. I think there's a huge role for the arts and humanities to play. Whether it's, I don't know, something even as like television. I mean, a medical colleague was telling me they were having real problems in getting the whole idea of preeclampsia and awareness of this across to many couples, until there was an episode of Downton Abbey, for heaven's sake, that had preeclampsia in it, and suddenly everybody knows about it. So, I mean, that's a terrible example, perhaps, of, sorry if I've got any Downton Abbey fans listening, of the arts and humanities. But in terms of, artistic renderings of life are so fundamental to all of us that we need these key issues to really be very clearly rehearsed within them. And it shouldn't just be the job of scientists to communicate these things in one direction. You guys should be talking to us and telling us what you feel about them. And that's why discussions like this are so important and I think so valuable.
I mean, I found that I tend to think there are different levels and different types of opportunities. I felt very sad. I think it was either yesterday or today when I had my, you get those Facebook memory things, and I had one which was of the Human Worlds Festival a couple of years ago when we did a cake decorating activity. And I thought that was really helpful way of communicating research, because we sat down. What happened was people came, the kids were enjoying decorating, the parents were enjoying decorating the cakes, and you could just talk in a very relaxed way about the research. So I'm really missing right now the opportunity to do face-to-face. Just talking to people in a relaxed way. I think that we all have to try and be much more inventive in these new times when we can't meet people face to face. But what I'm thinking about is really quite an intimate way of sharing research. So I think it is important to think about those different levels, the intimate level where you're talking to people and there is interaction between the researcher and the parent, and other ways of communicating where you're trying to reach out to a much greater number, much more efficiency, but you don't actually. It can be difficult to get quite that depth of interaction.
Because sites like can often just be an echo chamber, can't they, among a particular community, as with other aspects of social media. I don't see many researchers or medical colleagues joining in those discussions. We do need some more genuinely interactive platforms, don't we?
Yeah, I have quite good conversations on Twitter. I find with all sorts of different people, but I guess it's quite high intensity because you're talking to kind of one person, although lots of other people might be able to see it. But I do think that it's really important for researchers to get out and to talk and to let that frame anything that they're doing, which is going to aim to reach more people at once.
So we've got another question from Nicola now. This time it's for Mariana. She asks, have you looked at writing about the experience of pregnancy and birth as opposed to motherhood more generally? And she says she's thinking of, for example, cut, stapled and mended and heart of the womb.
Thanks, Nicola. Thanks for those suggestions. I have to admit that I haven't read, or I've seen their books. I haven't read either of those. So thank you very much. I'll look them up. I do also look at experiences of pregnancy and birth within literature. So it's definitely something I'm very interested in. So it's not just motherhood more generally. I look at all different interpretations of it. I even look at, this book by Sheila Heti that I look at, who she's not a mother herself, but the whole book, it's called Motherhood, and it's about her wanting, trying to decide whether she wants to become a mother. So I look at lots of different representations and interpretations of motherhood, including pregnancy and birth. More so pregnancy than birth, but that's just because that's what it's, I'm led by the literature and what's been written about more. So thanks, Nicola.
Great. Well, the next question is going to be from Alex, me, directed to Fiona, because we haven't had any questions specifically to you in the chat so far. So one thing you've written about is reproductive objectification. So what is this, and why do you think it's important to think about it?
Well, thank you very much, Alex. So most people will have heard of sexual objectification, and it's something that feminists have talked about a lot. That's where women are treated as sexual objects in a way that is bad, generally. And I think that there is a similar kind of phenomenon, which I call reproductive objectification, and that's not where you're treated as a sexual object, but where you're treated as an object for the production of offspring. So you're seen as really only valuable insofar as you are going to produce children, and valuable kind of insofar as you can make those children happy. And I think it's something that we see a lot in thinking about pregnancy, thinking about motherhood, pregnancy, and birth. I mean, the sort of all that matters is a healthy baby, that kind of discourse. That is an example of seeing the mother as kind of only valuable, as not really mattering in her own right. It's interesting. It kind of links to something that I was reading of Marx recently. Well, I was reading a chapter recently which had a quote from you, Mark, in which your quote was talking about the importance of maternal health, and how this really gave us reason for focusing on the health of young women, which sounds very good, but gave me a concern, because I have a worry about treating women as instrumentally valuable as a means to improving the well-being of future generations. So I think it's something that we need to watch out for in all areas. And I think that possibly the reason that this kind of quote rang some alarm bells for me is because I think it's a kind of more widespread phenomenon. And I think that context means that we have to be careful about how we think, even about things that prioritize women's well-being, if they're saying that women's well-being is important because it has effects on future generations.
If I could just chip in.
Yeah, you respond briefly before.
You touched on a very important area which concerns me a lot, and I don't think we have the answer yet. But as our research more and more moves towards health and lifestyle in the preconception period, we're now sort of in our work with school age students. The nightmare scenario is that we get to the point where we start to talk to young girls. Pretty much as soon as you start to menstruate, your job in life is going to, that's the very last, that's the nightmare. scenario, and I hope we can find ways of preventing that. Just because we understand something about the mechanisms that start in pregnancy doesn't mean to say that we go back to that terrible old idea of just seeing women's bodies as vessels for the next generation.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, all three of you. I've really enjoyed hearing you all speak to each other. And thanks to the viewers for their many excellent questions. We're hoping that we'll see some of you back at the third of these seminars on birth, which is going to take place at some time to be confirmed, yet to be confirmed in February. But just before you go, there's a few things I want to mention. So first, please help us know your thoughts about today's session so that we can improve future events by taking part in this short anonymous survey. The QR code's up there, which hopefully you can scan with your phone, or you can click on the link that's in the chat, or you can visit that web address there, which is bit.ly/HW20feedback. And as mentioned earlier today, this event is part of the wider program of the Human Worlds Festival, running from the 12th to the 22nd of November. To know more about the festival, download resources, explore immersive experiences, and join other live events, please visit www.humanworldsfestival.com. And finally, don't forget to book your free ticket for Hands-on Humanities Day on Saturday, the 21st of November, from 10:30 to 4:30 p.m. For the first time, this family-friendly day will take place exclusively online, starting with an interactive workshop in Blackboard Collaborate for little budding poets, followed by a live streaming on the University of Southampton Festival YouTube channel. Special guests include artists David Blandy and Larry Achiampong, and an exclusive Writers in Conversation live session with author Tracy Chevalier. Okay, and just one final thanks then to all of the speakers, to the viewers again, and all that's left is for all of us to say goodbye to all of you. So, goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.